In this video, I'm going to show you how I deflast tissue culture plants, what I do when they're contaminated with mold, and then how I transition them into leca. Hey, Pablo from Learning here, and I've always loved tissue culture plants because they allow me to purchase plants that are really expensive for an affordable price because they're so small. A good example is my Orange Princess, which I purchased for $60, and then I just deflasked and grew, and then it has now become this. So in this video, we're going to go through some examples of rare plants and some really common plants, but you're gonna see that with all of them, the process is basically the same. So I'm going to just walk you through the process, what materials you're going to need, and then I'm going to just do like a fast forward through me doing a bunch of different plants. And then in the end, I'm going to show you the final product, the update, and which plants survived, and unfortunately, which ones didn't. Sometimes sellers are going to sell you something that they call like a contaminated tissue culture or a Poo tissue culture, which I think is a funny name because I'm like 7. But also that means it's extra cheap for you to purchase plants. So before we even get into the plants, the first thing that you're going to need is some materials. So I'm going to walk you through the materials. I think it is really important for you to have at least the first few. The first is going to be a container with a lid that you can put on and stay on. This is because whenever you transition a tissue culture out of the flask, it goes from 100% humidity and you need to slowly transition it out. The humidity shock is going to be the #1 reason why the tissue culture plants crash. So you need to have something with a dome or something that can just keep the humidity inside. You can add some extra holes if you have a soldering iron. I think this is really helpful because it allows the substrate to dry out faster. And whenever you're dealing with tiny little tissue plants, you do not want the soil to stay too moist because then it's going to basically just cause root rot. Then for the substrate, you're going to need something like Sphagnum moss, like some premium, and then Perlite. There's some other stuff that you can use, but this is what I do. So what I do is I grab some moss and with scissors, I just chop it up really small, and then I mix it with some perlite. I try to keep it 50-50, if not a little bit more perlite than sphagnum. Because like I said, the most important thing for me is for the substrate to not stay too wet where it could cause some kind of rot on the tissue culture. Then you're going to need something with a reservoir. I like to use these cups because it fits perfectly and then the lid kind of like sticks in there. So even if it tips or something, the plant is going to stay somewhat safe. The other is completely optional, but I really like to use it with tissue culture plants because if you're watering like from the top constantly, you really increase the odds of it getting really damp and then rotting. So I like to use some of this Capillary Wicks because it keeps the moisture inside the substrate a little more consistent. So basically you're going to cut whatever size you feel comfortable with it. You're going to put it in the middle of the pot. So basically what you want is for part of the wick to be inside the reservoir part. So it keeps the humidity and keeps it pulling up. And it guarantees that the plant is drying out in a more consistent way rather than just completely drying out when the water stops touching the pot. Then I like to use some hydrogen peroxide mixture whenever I'm cleaning out my plants and just spraying it with it. I think it helps kill any potential rot that might be inside the plant. I think this is really necessary if you're dealing with something that is contaminated. Then if you're dealing with contaminated tissue culture, you need to do something for the mold that is growing in there. You can't just kind of like wash it. You need to ideally give it some kind of bath to clean it out. There's multiple things that you can use, but I found a research paper where they were talking about using this kind of copper for tissue culture plants to prevent the growth whenever they're contaminated. And I liked it enough to use it, and so far it has been really helpful. And then this part is completely optional, but you can use gloves. Personally, I don't like using gloves because I think it increases the odds of cross-contamination, and also it does not allow me to feel the plant. And when I'm dealing with tissue culture, which is really delicate plants, I want to make sure I don't break anything off, I don't snap anything by accident, and I just feel like the gloves like make that a lot more difficult. So I personally make sure to wash my hands really thoroughly before doing this process, and then I make sure to wash my hands really thoroughly whenever I'm done. And then I just keep a really important sort of aseptic technique using alcohol, and then just keeping in mind where I'm putting and what I'm touching as I'm doing this. So here's the list of all the plants that I am going to be deflasking and working with in this video. I took the first one and I'm going to basically do it with you and walk you through the process and kind of like how I do it. It was with my Whipple Way, which was contaminated with some mold. But for all the others, I feel like it's going to be a little repetitive. So for those, I created like almost a assembly system of the different steps. And I just went through all of the bags kind of like step by step in a fast way. So I'm just going to do a voiceover and speed up through that process because I want you to see it and sort of like how I handle the different plants depending on how contaminated or just messed up they were. And in the end, I'm going to have an update about all the plants.
So the first thing you need to do is just clean your surface. I use alcohol, wait 30 seconds and then wipe it clean, and then get some water for whatever containers you're going to use for the process, or the faucet works. Then remove the plant as quick as possible. I took my time because I wanted to show you the mold and how close it was to the plant, but ideally you wouldn't leave the lid open so long. You just want to get it in and out. I use a skewer basically to just fish out the plant really quickly, trying to not touch the sides or anything that has any of the mold. I basically just drop it, close the container, and then rinse out everything, any agar, anything that is attaching to the plant. In this case, there was almost nothing. So ideally you would do this under the faucet or something like that. And then you're gonna put in the solution with the hydrogen peroxide for maybe 2 to 5 minutes. Just see if anything is bubbling. If everything looks fine, then you can just move it to what I use, like copper. This is just a tiny little bit, it just turns really blue. And then you're gonna put it in there for like 5 minutes. I usually just do it while I'm doing something else, almost like an assembly line. And then once it's been, 5 minutes, you can either rinse it out again before putting it in the pot, or you can put it directly, however you feel more comfortable. You do a little opening in the middle of the media, just place it really gently, put the lid on it, and then close the holes with some tape.
We are going to basically be preparing some Poo tissue cultures. What does Poo tissue culture mean? It basically means that the plant is looking a little rough. So this is a really good example of it. It's mostly, let's say, rotten or it's not working out. It has some mold. It's basically a contaminated sample. The survival of this kind of plants is definitely not guaranteed. They're like super icky and gross. But that is okay, because basically what that means is that it's going to be a lot cheaper for me to be able to purchase them and play with them, and they're a good way of testing out and just testing out tissue culture. So let's do the first plant, the one that I really want to make sure it's doing really well. This is the variegated Joepii. It's a really cool plant. I think it has these really interesting leaves. I know it's the one with the story about the person, Dr. Joepii, basically finding it. So I'm gonna pull it out of its thing with this, and I'm gonna drop it in the water, and then thinking that it was like eaten by insects, and then he collected a sample, and then it turned out that the leaf was actually like that. And then another 1/3 of hydrogen peroxide. Then we're gonna fish our little plantlet out and then drop it in there. And what that's going to do is basically get rid of any rotten tissue that might be in there, so like growing. And then I just put in one of these flasks, and then I just create like a little bit of like a circular motion, which was super gross on the thing. But it's supposed to be a orange marmalade, which I learned Prince of Orange, so this was definitely one that I wanted. I had already purchased it from a different vendor before, but unfortunately I think I got scammed or something, and I just got sent the incorrect plant. It was through Etsy, and you guys know how like that is super iffy. Water, which in this case around like 50 mils, and then I do around another 1/4 of this hydrogen peroxide, and then I just drop in there the tissue culture plant, tighten it, and then we give it a little swirl, basically. Then we have the other one, which is bubbling a little bit, which I like, and then I just keep swirling it around. That's gonna help make sure that anything in there basically kind of dies off. Cool. Alright, so the next one is going to be the Alocasia Bambino Variegated. So it's been a few weeks and I finally transitioned all my plants out of the humidity domes and into just the normal cabinet temperature. So I'm going to walk you through all of them and update you in the order of perceived value. So I'm going to go from like the cheapest ones, which were basically the 5-pack with a bunch of them. And then in the end, I'm just going to go with the most expensive. So the first one is the Syngonium pink confetti. This is a plant that had 5 of them. Whenever I opened it and I was cleaning it, this was probably the one that was kind of like gunkiest, along with the red Anderson. So out of all of them, I think out of the gate, I knew one of them was going to be not going to make it. It was just looking just like a bulb. So I did not think it had a lot of hope. And I was right. It died fairly quickly. And then all the other 4 kind of like went with it. One of the 4 just like died. I did not even notice. And then the other ones have had a really uneven growth, which is something that you're going to also see in the red Anderson. And that is almost so much the variability that you get with the plants, even if they're in the same bag, even though they're the same tissue culture, all the plants are just going to be slightly different. So this is a good example. So here you have a big one that is kind of basically taking over most of the pot, and you see has this beautiful leaf, then not so much. And then you have on the side this other one, which is trying really hard, and I think it's going to probably put out a really nice leaf next because I see a lot of pink. And then you have this tiny little baby that is just trying so hard. It just has been struggling. I'm not sure if it's because of the roots. I'm not sure if it's because of some other factor, but this third one is not doing as well. So you see how different this size is, even in the same container, in the same conditions. Up next is the red Anderson. I actually separated one of them because I thought it was looking really nice with this kind of half moon and it's turning kind of pinkish. So I wanted to isolate it. This is another one that I'm really surprised that all of them survived because it was not looking really nice when I was doing the opening and the cleaning. This is another one that has a lot of variability within the own pack. As you can see in the video, you see this one that has a lot of really nice white. Then you have these other ones that have more of a marbling. You have this one that actually kind of low in variegation, which is kind of interesting. And then you have another one that has also really interesting patterns. And then a few of them, because tissue culture, are actually having tiny little babies on the side that are really, really variegated. So they might not make it, but this might just become like way more plants just because of those tiny little babies. I'm actually pretty excited about this plant. I have seen some really, really cool specimens when they get big. That's why I'm trying to get it into its own pot while, you know, still easy to repot. But I also know it's a slow grower and they have a lot of variability clearly. So I'll keep you posted 100% on all of them if I swap them or anything like that. I'm really excited about this one. And look at the price. I mean, you can't beat that. This one is my orange marmalade. I did not kind of do enough research about this. I just thought it was like a variegated Prince of Orange, which is not. It gets kind of really big, and I bought this from another seller. They sent me something. I did not think it was a marmalade, so I purchased this this pack basically because it was really cheap, and I was like, you know what, I want this plant. It ended up coming with 2 plants in it, and then around it, another thing for tissue culture, it just ended up getting a bunch of little babies all around, which you can see right there. This one is growing also really interesting. One of the big plants is just taking over. Everything else is kind of little. I'm just keeping an eye on it, seeing how it grows. It will eventually need a moss ball, so you know it will get big. But for now, I'm really enjoying just the orange into the yellow. It's been kind of like an okay plant, but it transitioned really, really well out of tissue culture into its own container. So this one was really easy. This is a Homalomena Rubescens Pink Splash. This was a lottery, basically. I just bought a random ticket and they sent me a random plant with my order. I was kind of not mad about it because I really want a Homalomena Pink Diamond in the future. So I think this is going to be great training wheels. I don't love the way it looks. I mean, some specimens are really, really cool, but most of them look okay. I think this plant really scared me and I thought it was going to completely crash. After I transitioned it, even within like 24 hours, even when the container was completely sealed, I want to say most of the leaves, they completely melted, they turned yellow, and then I had to just chop, 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 and it just ended up being like this one stem. So I was really, really shocked and surprised at how bad it transitioned out. It just completely had a lot of struggle. I'm assuming it was because of the humidity. I left it in that container for months because I was like too lazy and I was waiting for the other one to get contaminated for this video. So I think I left it in there too long. It got too big and it did not enjoy the transition. So it had to put out some more energy. So far it's doing okay. There's 2 of them in there. So I'm really, really hoping that at least one makes it and it gives me some training wheels for when I finally splurge and get a pink diamond. Up next is my Whipple Way. This is a plant that I am really specific on the kind of plant that I wanna for it to look like. And so far, this tissue culture is doing a great job. It's starting to turn a little bit of pink, which you get that with a sun stress. And the variegation is really wide, starts with little splotches. So far, it's a great plant. It did not struggle with the transition period, unlike the others. I mean, it did not lose one leaf. It was perfectly fine. Once I started taking the tape of the holes in the dome, like it was perfectly okay, no issues. I took it out and so far it's enjoying its life. So this Whipple Way did a really good job transitioning and that's how much I pay for it. Up next is one that I am sort of, you know, hoping for the best. It was a Poo, so I realized that, you know, there's no guarantee. It was basically a contaminated dead plant, right? But this is a variegated Joepii, which is a really cool plant. If you have seen it on Instagram, you see how cool they get. They had a really interesting leaf with an interesting backstory. And the variegation can be really varied. It goes from really yellow, I've seen some greener ones. So it's an interesting plant when it's variegated. So I was really excited when I was able to win this auction for this tissue culture. And when I got it, it was not completely poop. I put it in here and it has been really slow grower. I was a little concerned that it was going to get too moist and then just rot away. But so far it has just been really, really slow. It put out 2 new leaves, you see that, and then the other one's kind of elongated. The variegation on the other leaves kind of faded. So when I got it, you could see very clearly where the variegation was. And now they got really green. So I don't know if it's because of the light, the transition. I'm not sure. I'm hoping that the other leaves begin to show some of this variegation. And if it doesn't, I mean, it's fine. It was just a tissue culture. I'll just keep it in my wish list. But I have really high hopes for this plant. And I'm so glad that it's not dying. But I think it's going to be a very slow process because it's just taking really long for it to size up. And then this is my Philodendron Spiritus-sancti. It's one of those plants that was, I think, in a lot of people's wish list a few years back because it was just really rare. It was in everybody's like top 10 rare plant list. It was like #1. So everybody wanted to get their hands on it. Then it hit like the tissue culture market, and then they flooded everywhere with Spiritus-sancti, and that completely plummeted the price. I paid like $40 for these two plants. This plant actually, it was growing inside the container really well. It was having no issues. Again, I think I left it in there way too long, waiting for the Whipple Way to get contaminated more with the mold that it came with. So I think it just stayed in the container too long. It was like already pushing against like the sides. It was getting too big for it. So when I transitioned it out, this plant also crashed. It did not have a good time. All of the leaves that were there like completely melted. It was not as fast as the Homalomena, but they definitely struggled a little bit. Eventually, I was able to just keep it in the dome a lot longer. And then now you see that it put out a few more leaves and it's just acclimating to its environment. So I think this might be a slower process just because of the transition shock, but I think it's going to be fine just because both specimens are, I think, doing pretty well. Now let's talk about those plants that did not make it. I had a few casualties. Unfortunately, it was plants that I really wanted. The first one was the Alocasia pink Bambino. You can see the video that I took when I was deflasking it, and you can see how pink it was. The moment I realized how pink it was, my heart dropped, and I was like, oh no, this plant has no chlorophyll. It's barely hanging on by this couple of leaves that are older, but all of the new growth was full pink, and it had a few little offshoots that had a little bit of green that I had some hopes for him. Unfortunately, that plant also completely melted. It looked okay for a few days, but then all those variegated leaves just completely melted. You can see some of the pictures that I took, the video. It got kind of gross. Every time I would spray it with my hydrogen peroxide mixture, it would just bubble. And yeah, it just slowly just died. I think that was my mistake. I should have, I think for those kind of plants, I'm just gonna try to get them either already acclimated or make sure they're not super variegated. I couldn't see it whenever I purchased it because it wasn't like in a bag and in a live stream, and we were sort of like betting, so it was kind of like a rush. But if I would have seen it in person, I don't think I would have purchased it because I saw how much variegation was in it. And that, I think, also caused the death of the other plant, which was the Philodendron Blizzard, I guess, or just the Giganteum Variegated. I assumed that it was a blizzard. I think the issue was that it had too much variegation as well. The leaves were coming out very small. They were really white. It took a long time to get some bit of green in them. And then I think the substrate stayed too wet because that one did not have a wick. I was just kind of like just watering it and making sure it would stay moist. And it ended up just getting kind of like root rot and then kind of rotting from like the stem into the leaves. But the leaves were growing very small. You can see some of the videos of that. So I think that one also struggled because my specimen just happened to be super high in variegation. And those plants just have a much difficult time growing and sizing up and being able to fight back to stuff like, some root rot. So I hope this video makes you feel more comfortable trying out some tissue culture plants. There's a bunch of stores out there. Try out something. If you are scared of, losing your money because they die, get something like a Poo. Go through the process of cleaning out the contamination, keep it, grow it. It's going to be a great experience for you. And I think it's such a good way of accessing the plants that otherwise you wouldn't get. I think that is just a lot of benefits. And I know some people have a lot of criticisms for tissue culture, so I am going to make sure that we have a conversation about that in a different video because I also agree with both sides, so I kind of want to have that conversation with you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and this video is probably the one you want to watch next.